In 1962, when Johnny Carson took over The Tonight Show and changed television forever, he opened his desk to Hollywood's biggest icons, legendary stars whose names lit up marquees around the world. Over the next 3 decades, men and women like all stepped onto that stage with smiles. But behind the laughter and applause, Johnny Carson saw sides of them the cameras never captured. Tonight, decades later, we uncover the 5 Golden Age guests Johnny Carson came to privately fear, distrust, and quietly avoid off-camera. The first figure who looms over this conversation is Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was not merely a star of Hollywood's Golden Age, he was its foundation. Before dialogue, before celebrity culture fully formed, Chaplin taught the world how cinema could speak without words. His little tramp character embodied tenderness in a harsh industrial world, a figure of empathy who turned poverty, loneliness, and humiliation into quiet poetry. By the time Johnny Carson became the most powerful gatekeeper in American television, Chaplin's name had already ascended beyond criticism. He was treated less like a man and more like a sacred artifact, a genius whose contribution to art placed him above ordinary judgment. But behind that untouchable image existed a private history that deeply unsettled many within the industry. Chaplin's personal life revealed a repeated pattern of relationships with girls barely in their teens, marriages to minors, and an imbalance of power so extreme that even in an era known for moral permissiveness, it stood out. These were not isolated lapses or misunderstood romances framed unfairly by later standards. They were documented relationships, legal proceedings, and first-hand accounts that painted a picture of manipulation and control. Chaplin's fame did not merely attract vulnerable young women, it created a system in which they had little ability to refuse him. What disturbed figures like Johnny Carson was not just what Chaplin did, but how effortlessly he escaped consequences. Hollywood protected him. Admirers rationalized him. Critics were dismissed as jealous or puritanical. The industry's reverence for Chaplin's genius became a moral anesthetic, numbing any serious examination of his behavior. Carson, who believed that talent did not grant immunity from decency, reportedly viewed Chaplin as an early example of Hollywood's most dangerous habit, confusing brilliance with virtue. By the time Carson dominated late-night television, Chaplin symbolized something larger than his own scandals. He represented a cautionary tale about unchecked power. Carson had spent decades watching celebrities perform kindness under bright lights, while revealing indifference or cruelty when they believed no one important was watching. Chaplin's story reinforced Carson's belief that some of the most revered figures in entertainment were also the most protected from accountability. Genius, in Chaplin's case, functioned like camouflage. Chaplin's public exile from America in the 1950s, amid political controversy and moral scrutiny, did little to resolve the deeper issue. Even in absence, his reputation remained divided between worship and discomfort. Carson, according to those who knew him, did not see Chaplin as a tragic victim of misunderstanding, nor as a simple villain. He saw him as proof that immense creative power, when left unchecked by ethical restraint, can become corrosive. Chaplin didn't need to appear on The Tonight Show to leave an impression on Carson's worldview. His legacy already illustrated how easily Hollywood could confuse artistic contribution with moral innocence. In Carson's private moral framework, Chaplin belonged to a rare category, figures whose cultural impact was undeniable, but whose personal conduct cast a long, disturbing shadow. This was not about judging a man by modern standards alone. It was about recognizing patterns of exploitation that were evident even to contemporaries, yet repeatedly ignored. To Carson, Chaplin represented the moment Hollywood first failed to draw a line, and in doing so taught generations of powerful men that talent could excuse almost anything. Chaplin's story sits at the beginning of this list for a reason. He was not the loudest or most volatile figure. He was something more dangerous. He was quiet, adored, protected, and rarely challenged. Secondly, Errol Flynn entered Hollywood like a force of nature. He didn't simply play heroes. He redefined what a leading man looked like during the golden age of cinema. With his athletic build, mischievous grin, and effortless confidence, Flynn became the embodiment of adventure itself, On screen, he was freedom, romance, and bravado wrapped into one irresistible figure. Audiences didn't just admire him, they wanted to be him. By the time Johnny Carson rose to prominence, Flynn's image had already been etched into the cultural imagination as the ultimate swashbuckler, a man whose charm felt both timeless and untouchable. Yet behind that carefully preserved image was a life spiraling out of control, leaving emotional wreckage in its wake. Flynn's off-screen reputation was notorious even by Hollywood's famously permissive standards. Alcohol abuse, reckless behavior, and chronic self-destruction became defining features of his private existence. But what truly disturbed those who knew him was not his indulgence. It was his disregard for the well-being of others. Numerous contemporaries described Flynn as a man who treated people, particularly women, as expendable accessories to his pleasure. His charm, so captivating on camera, became a weapon of it. Accusations of sexual assault followed Flynn during his career, allegations serious enough to reach the courtroom. Though he was acquitted, the trials shattered the illusion of harmless roguishness and exposed a darker pattern of behavior. For many insiders, the verdict did not equate to moral vindication. Rather, it highlighted how fame and public adoration could sway outcomes in silent scrutiny. Carson, who valued emotional intelligence and personal restraint, reportedly viewed Flynn as emblematic of a deeper Hollywood sickness, the normalization of predatory behavior as long as the star remained profitable. What made Flynn particularly unsettling was his volatility. He was not merely indulgent. He was unpredictable. Biographers and colleagues recount episodes of explosive temper, cruel mockery, and emotional manipulation. His relationships were frequently marked by imbalance and coercion, with Flynn exerting dominance through charisma and status rather than physical force alone. To Carson, this kind of power dynamic was profoundly dangerous. He understood that the most destructive personalities were often those who smiled while crossing lines, leaving others confused, ashamed, or silenced. By the later years of Flynn's life, his body bore the consequences of his excesses. He aged rapidly, his health deteriorating under the weight of addiction and recklessness. Yet even as his physical strength faded, his sense of entitlement did not. Flynn continued to behave as though the world owed him indulgence, a belief reinforced by years of studio protection and public adoration. Carson reportedly saw this trajectory not as tragic romance, but as a warning, an example of how unchecked celebrity can hollow out a person's capacity for empathy. For Johnny Carson, Flynn represented a category of star he found especially troubling, the charming destroyer. Unlike openly cruel figures who announced their hostility, Flynn disarmed people first. He made them laugh, made them feel chosen, then discarded them without consequence. This pattern resonated deeply with Carson's own observations of fame's darker mechanics. Carson believed that how someone treated others when they had power revealed their true nature, and Flynn consistently failed that test. Hollywood for decades sold Errol Flynn as a lovable rogue, a man whose excesses were part of his myth, but Carson's private assessment, echoed by many insiders, stripped away the romance. Flynn was not dangerous because he drank too much or lived too fast. He was dangerous because his charm allowed harm to flourish unnoticed. In that sense, Flynn was not merely a flawed star of the golden age, he was a symbol of how easily charisma can camouflage cruelty. Errol Flynn's legacy, when viewed through Carson's lens, becomes less about adventure and more about accountability deferred. His story forces a difficult reckoning with Hollywood's past, a reminder that some legends were built not just on talent, but on silence. And for Johnny Carson, whose career was defined by observation rather than confrontation, Flynn stood as a stark example of what happens when a system rewards magnetism and ignores the cost paid by those caught in its orbit. Thirdly, Frank Sinatra was not merely a singer or an actor, he was an atmosphere. When he entered a room, the temperature changed. His voice carried longing, swagger, vulnerability, and menace all at once, and audiences felt as though he was singing directly to them. By the time Johnny Carson became the undisputed king of late-night television, Sinatra was already a living institution, an American myth wrapped in a tuxedo, backed by orchestras, applause, and decades of cultural dominance. On television, he appeared warm, witty, and self-aware, the ultimate guest who could charm both the host and the audience with effortless ease. But behind that polished surface was a man many insiders found deeply intimidating. Sinatra's off-screen reputation was built not just on talent, but on fear. Biographers, fellow performers, and industry executives have long described him as volatile, easily provoked, and prone to explosive anger. His temper was legendary, and his reactions to perceived slights, real or imagined, could be swift and severe. For Johnny Carson, who prized control, rhythm, and emotional intelligence, on live television, Sinatra represented unpredictability at its most dangerous. Carson reportedly admired Sinatra's artistry, but remained wary of his presence. Unlike other powerful guests, Sinatra did not simply command respect. He demanded submission. Stories circulated throughout Hollywood of assistants fired, careers stalled, and colleagues humiliated after crossing him. Whether these actions were deliberate or fueled by paranoia and insecurity, the effect was the same. Sinatra cultivated an aura where people walked on eggshells. Carson, an acute observer of human behavior, recognized that this kind of power often masked deep emotional instability. One of the most persistent shadows surrounding Sinatra was his alleged connection to organized crime figures. While never legally proven, the associations were widely discussed in journalistic investigations and biographies. These rumors alone were enough to create unease. In an industry where perception often matters more than proof, Sinatra's proximity to dangerous people amplified his own sense of menace. Carson, whose show depended on live spontaneity and safety, reportedly found this aspect of Sinatra's reputation particularly unsettling. You could not predict where the joke would land, or how Sinatra might respond. What made Sinatra especially troubling was the contrast between his public vulnerability and private aggression. He sang about heartbreak, loneliness, and emotional pain with raw authenticity, yet many who knew him described a man capable of cruelty when challenged. Romantic relationships were often turbulent, marked by jealousy, control, and emotional volatility. Former partners and associates spoke of a man who could be tender one moment and terrifying the next. To Carson, this duality was not poetic. It was a warning sign. Sinatra's need for control extended beyond his personal life into professional spaces. He wanted loyalty, obedience, and affirmation, and he reacted harshly when he felt disrespected. Even powerful figures hesitated to confront him. Carson, though outwardly unflappable, understood that true authority came from restraint, not domination. Sinatra's approach clashed directly with Carson's philosophy. Where Carson diffused tension with humor and silence, Sinatra escalated it with force of personality. As the years passed, Sinatra's behavior became more erratic. Aging did not soften his edge. In some ways, it sharpened it. The world changed. Cultural power shifted, and Sinatra struggled with relevance while still expecting reverence. This friction often manifested as bitterness and hostility. Carson reportedly saw in Sinatra a man who could not tolerate losing control, not over rooms, not over his own legend. Hollywood long excused Sinatra's behavior because of his genius. His voice, his timing, his emotional precision, these were treated as justification for almost anything. But Carson privately represented a new kind of power, quieter, observational, and resistant to intimidation. From that vantage point, Sinatra's legacy looked less romantic and more cautionary. He was not feared because he was talented. He was feared because his anger carried consequences. In classic Hollywood lore, Sinatra is remembered as the chairman of the board, a man who ruled by charisma and command. But through Johnny Carson's eyes, he also embodied the darker side of unchecked fame, a person whose brilliance gave cover to behavior that harmed others, silenced dissent, and normalized fear. Carson understood that true greatness did not require intimidation. Sinatra never seemed to learn that lesson. Frank Sinatra remains one of the most influential performers in American history. But influence is not the same as integrity. His story, when examined honestly, reveals how power can distort even the most gifted soul. For Johnny Carson, Sinatra was not simply a difficult guest. He was a reminder that charm, when fused with rage and entitlement, can become something deeply corrosive. Fourthly, Joan Crawford did not rise to the top of Hollywood by accident. She engineered herself with relentless precision, transforming from a poor, insecure young woman into one of the most powerful stars of the Golden Age. On screen, she radiated strength, elegance, and emotional intensity. She played women who survived, endured, and conquered hostile worlds, and audiences believed her because she lived that ferocity in real life. By the time Johnny Carson became a cultural authority, Crawford was already a legend, an Oscar winner whose name alone carried weight, fear, and reverence across the industry. But Crawford's power came at a cost, and those closest to her often paid the highest price. Long before Mommy Dearest shocked the public, Hollywood insiders whispered about her cruelty behind closed doors. Studio staff, assistants, and even fellow actors described her as controlling, volatile, and emotionally merciless. Crawford demanded absolute obedience, not just professionalism. She believed hierarchy was sacred and that fear was an acceptable management tool. Carson, who detested emotional tyranny, reportedly viewed Crawford as one of the most psychologically dangerous figures of her era. What made Crawford especially unsettling was her obsession with image. She did not simply protect her public persona. She enforced it. Everything around her had to reinforce the illusion of perfection. Lighting, camera angles, conversation, even silence. Any threat to that image was treated as betrayal. This obsession bled into her private life, where control replaced affection. Friends described relationships that felt more like interrogations than connections. Love, in Crawford's world, came with conditions. The most haunting accounts came from within her own home. Allegations of emotional and physical abuse toward her adopted children circulated privately for years before exploding into public consciousness. Whether every detail of those stories is debated or not, what remains consistent is the pattern of fear. Children, employees, and companions alike described a woman whose moods ruled the environment, where approval was unpredictable and punishment could be swift. Carson understood that true cruelty often hides behind authority and respectability, and Crawford's exemplified that dynamic. Crawford's behavior was not impulsive chaos. It was calculated dominance. She believed suffering forged strength and that discipline justified pain. This belief mirrored an old Hollywood mentality that equated cruelty with professionalism. Carson, representing a newer era of emotional awareness, found this worldview deeply disturbing. He saw Crawford as a relic of a system that rewarded emotional abuse as long as the box office stayed strong. On television, Crawford could appear composed, articulate, even vulnerable. But those who worked with her knew the performance did not end when the cameras stopped. She monitored conversations, controlled narratives, and punished dissent. Carson, whose power came from observation rather than intimidation, reportedly felt an undercurrent of menace around her. She was not unpredictable like Sinatra or reckless like Flynn. She was methodical, and that made her more frightening. As Crawford aged, the industry that once bowed to her began to move on. Youth replaced authority, and relevance slipped away. Instead of softening, Crawford hardened. She clung to control more fiercely, turning inward and becoming increasingly isolated. Carson saw in her decline not poetic tragedy, but a lesson. Power built on fear cannot survive vulnerability. When admiration fades, only relationships remain. And Crawford had burned too many bridges. Hollywood later tried to frame Crawford as a misunderstood woman, a victim of sexism and ageism. There is truth in that. But Carson's private assessment allowed for complexity without absolution. Being wronged does not excuse wrongdoing. Crawford fought a brutal system, but she also perpetuated brutality within her own sphere. She survived cruelty by becoming fluent in it. In classic Hollywood mythology, Joan Crawford is remembered as a survivor, a diva, a symbol of resilience. But through Johnny Carson's lens, She also represented the emotional casualties of unchecked ambition. She proved that success achieved through domination leaves scars not only on others, but on the self. Her legacy is not just one of triumph, but of warning. Joan Crawford terrified people not because she was powerful, but because she believed power justified pain. Carson, who understood the quiet strength of restraint, recognized her as one of the most chilling examples of how Hollywood once mistook fear for respect. Her story remains one of the darkest reminders that perfection, when enforced through cruelty, destroys everything it touches. Fifthly, John Wayne was not just a movie star. He was an ideology made flesh. For decades, he stood as the cinematic definition of American masculinity, unyielding, stoic, morally certain, and physically dominant. His walk, his voice, his posture all communicated authority without question. To millions of viewers, Wayne represented courage, patriotism, and moral clarity. By the time Johnny Carson ruled late-night television, Wayne had become something more than an actor. He was a symbol, and symbols are dangerous when they refuse to evolve. Behind the heroic image, however, was a man whose real-life behavior troubled many who worked with him. Industry peers frequently described Wayne as domineering, dismissive, and aggressively intolerant of viewpoints that challenged his own. He did not debate, he asserted. He did not persuade, he overwhelmed. Carson, who built his empire on nuance, timing, and psychological awareness, reportedly found Wayne's rigid worldview deeply unsettling. Wayne represented a form of power that allowed no room for reflection or empathy. Wayne's personal politics were extreme even for his time, and they were not quietly held. He expressed openly racist views, supported blacklisting during the McCarthy era, and aligned himself with authoritarian ideas under the banner of patriotism. These positions were not rumors, they were recorded in interviews and public statements. For Carson, whose humor often relied on subtle subversion and emotional intelligence, Wayne's certainty felt less like strength and more like hostility toward complexity. Wayne saw disagreement as weakness, and weakness, in his worldview, deserved no mercy. On film sets, Wayne's behavior often mirrored his public persona. Colleagues described an environment where intimidation replaced collaboration. He was known to belittle co-stars, dismiss women's contributions, and exert control through sheer physical and psychological presence. While some excused this as old-school masculinity, others recognized it for what it was: bullying normalized by fame. Carson understood that true confidence does not need to humiliate others, and Wayne's constant need to dominate suggested deep insecurity beneath the bravado. Wayne's treatment of women further complicated his legacy. Numerous accounts portray him as emotionally dismissive, controlling, and unfaithful, with relationships shaped more by entitlement than mutual respect. He projected strength publicly while demanding submission privately. Carson, who carefully guarded the emotional safety of his show and his guests, reportedly saw Wayne as a man whose charm masked an inability to engage with others as equals. What made Wayne particularly dangerous as a cultural figure was not just his behavior, but the way it was celebrated. Hollywood rewarded his aggression, framing it as leadership. Audiences absorbed his certainty as virtue. Carson recognized this as one of the most insidious aspects of fame. When cruelty is mistaken for strength, it becomes aspirational. Wayne did not simply hold power. He modeled how to wield it without question, and that model left little space for compassion. As American culture began to change in the later decades of Wayne's life, his refusal to adapt became more pronounced. Rather than reflect, he doubled down. Civil rights movements, shifting gender roles, and evolving moral conversations were met not with curiosity but with contempt. Carson, whose career thrived on reading the room and evolving with the audience, understood that rigidity is the enemy of longevity. Wayne's certainty aged into bitterness. Johnny Carson never publicly condemned John Wayne in dramatic fashion, but those who understood Carson's values could sense the distance. Carson believed humor was a bridge. Wayne treated ideology as a weapon. Carson used silence and restraint. Wayne used volume and force. The contrast was stark. In Wayne, Carson saw a man whose myth had outgrown his humanity, leaving little room for accountability or growth. Today, John Wayne's films remain influential, but his legacy is increasingly examined through a more honest lens. Strength without empathy is no longer admired. Certainty without reflection is no longer trusted. Carson understood this shift before it became mainstream. He recognized that Wayne's brand of authority belonged to a fading world, one that confused dominance for virtue and mistook fear for respect. John Wayne was not feared because he lacked talent or discipline. He was feared because he believed his righteousness excused harm. Through Johnny Carson's quiet judgment, Wayne stands as a final cautionary figure of the Golden Age. A reminder that icons can inspire millions while still wounding those closest to them. His story closes this chapter not with condemnation, but with a question that still lingers. What kind of strength do we choose to celebrate, and at what cost?